let me be clear. America wants a strong, peaceful, and prosperous Russia.
Working to drastically reshape U.S. relations with a skeptical Russia. President Obama says the two countries are not destined to be antagonists. Can Obama sweet-talk his way out of military, wealth, and dominance rivalry? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mariam Namazi. Can the US and Russia ever bury the hatchet? That's the million-dollar question as the two presidents met in Moscow. Dmitry Medvedev and Barack Obama discussed various contentious issues over the two-day summit that began on Monday. Both committed to a new era of cooperation and signed 8 separate agreements to that effect. Now, this included an arms control treaty to replace an agreement made in 1991 due to expire in December. Under the new pact, the two countries are expected to reduce their nuclear warheads by up to 1/3 within 7 years. Also, Russia agreed to allow the US to fly weapons, hardware and personnel across its territory to Afghanistan, some progress there. However, some issues are still on the table. For example, the US missile defense shield in Europe, which the Russians oppose, and the way Moscow deals with its neighbors, specifically Georgia and Ukraine, and its relationship with Iran are just some of the issues that the US has with Russia. Well, joining us today are our guests in Washington, D.C., Richard White, Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Political Military Analysis at Hudson Institute. In Moscow, Ivan Sanfranchuk, Senior Lecturer at Moscow State Institute of International Relations. And also in Moscow, Fred Weir, a Russian affairs expert and a regular contributor to the Christian Science Monitor. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. So President Barack Obama has been meeting with Russian leaders. He also delivered a speech directly to the Russian people. Let's begin by listening to what Obama had to say about the current state of relations between Russia and the U.S.
Given our interdependence, any world order that tries to elevate one nation or one group of people over another will inevitably fail. The pursuit of power is no longer a zero-sum game. Progress must be shared. That's why I have called for a reset in relations between the United States and Russia. This must be more than a fresh start between the Kremlin and the White House, though that is important.
Fred Weir, if I can begin with you, we heard Obama there describing this trip as an opportunity to, quote, reset U.S. relations with Russia. Has there been any improvement in U.S.-Russia relations as a result of this trip?
Oh, yes. I think that these two agreements that you mentioned earlier, the Arms Control Framework Accord and the transport corridor to Afghanistan, those are two things that really couldn't have been accomplished under the previous White House administration. And on top of that, Obama has given the clear impression of a guy who has heard Russian concerns about things like missile defense and NATO expansion. And though he hasn't given much on those fronts, he sounds like he understands what the Russians are saying. And that, too, is really a leap forward over the previous administration. So although I'm not overly optimistic about the way ahead, I think that alone was reason enough for him to come to Moscow.
Ivan Sanfranchuk, is it also a question of who is really in charge? Because, of course, the former Russian president, Vladimir Putin, continues to wield enormous influence inside the Kremlin.
Well, I don't think it is a very important question because the leader of Russia is the president, and the name of the president is Medvedev. Vladimir Putin is prime minister. They are top figures in Russia, and I don't think that it makes any sense to try to play on any alleged differences between them. I think on foreign policy they are very much allied.
Mr. White, Obama spoke out against the old ways of thinking ahead of this trip. He spoke out against the fact that the US and Russia are destined to compete for spheres of influence. He said that these assumptions are wrong. Was that a message, perhaps, to Vladimir Putin?
It can certainly be read that way, but also perhaps to President Medvedev. Vladimir Putin, for example, his speech before the Munich Security Conference 2 years ago, or President Medvedev, in some of the comments he was making after the Georgia war, made statements that implied that Russia had special concerns, special interests in the former Soviet space, and that would, in particularly Georgia and Ukraine. And President Obama mentioned those two countries, particularly Georgia, at his joint press conference and his speeches and so on. So he's indicated, which he almost needs to do for domestic reasons as well, that he is affirming the independence of those two countries.
Okay, I want to look at the sticking points and the obstacles to an improvement in US-Russia relations later on. But right now, let's focus on what did come out of the meeting between the US and Russian presidents. This is what President Barack Obama had to say about a US-Russia nuclear deal.
President Medvedev and I made progress on negotiating a new treaty that will substantially reduce our warheads and delivery systems. We renewed our commitment to clean, safe, and peaceful nuclear energy.
Fred, what are your thoughts on that? Not a breakthrough, but certainly some progress. They reached a preliminary understanding on cuts to their nuclear arsenals.
Yes, and they're pretty substantial cuts. It really is a revival of that long period of Soviet-American arms control in which two superpowers negotiated as equals, because they were equal in the ability to completely destroy each other. And they had the full panoply of things like verification and compliance. And it was in itself the meat of relations often between the United States and the Soviet Union for many long years. And that has lapsed in recent years, and George W. Bush actually tried to bury it. But it's back now and almost in full scale. And that can, in itself, become something of an engine of future relations. At least that's the hope.
Mr. White, Obama and Medvedev have agreed, as we've been hearing, the two countries will seek by the year's end to cut their nuclear stockpiles by up to a third. But how much of a difference will these cuts actually make in practical terms?
Well, I was actually somewhat surprised. This was certainly less than some of the comments that came out, at least the American side, made you think what might be realized. What they've done in terms of the totals is very close to what they're going to end up with anyway. The current existing treaties, START 1 expires at the end of the year, but the Moscow Treaty carries on, and the Moscow Treaty limits, the lowest was 1,700 warheads, and now they've agreed to go down to 1,675 at the highest of the current band. So I don't see much of a reduction, actually. As I said, the Obama team, before they left about a month ago, was saying, well, we might go for a short duration treaty now, and then go for much deeper cuts later. But the current framework agreement says that they will take 7 years to reach those levels. And I think that they would have reached those levels in any case, even without the treaty that they've yet to finalize.
Ivan Sanfranchuk, Obama said in his speech at Moscow's New Economic School that he wants to, quote, identify mutual interests and expand dialogue and cooperation. Is it in Russia's interest to make cuts in the number of nuclear warheads?
Of course, it is in the Russian interest, it is in the American interest, and it is in the interest of the whole world, because in the previous 8 years, when the Bush administration was in charge of the American foreign policy, they were sending absolutely wrong signals to the world. And lack of arms control contributed a lot to problems with non-proliferation. So yes, it is absolutely important to have arms control back in our bilateral relations. However, I would stress that at the current stage, arms control cannot be the only important topic in Russian-American relations. There are other issues which America wants to have in the dialogue. This is Iran, Afghanistan, counterterrorism,
well, on the issue of Afghanistan, Fred Weir, let me ask you, there was progress on that particular issue. Russia did agree to allow the United States to transport weapons, hardware and personnel across its territory to Afghanistan. What's the significance of that?
Well, that's awfully important, and it's a practical thing that the Russians can do to help, because apparently the main supply route for the NATO mission in Afghanistan through Pakistan is in pretty dire peril and could even collapse at some moment. So having this route and all forms of materiel being allowed to be transported through it is a really a major practical concession that the Russians have made.
Way to go there.
And it will make a difference, and hopefully it can become a thing that will, drive
Mr.
better
Sanfranchuk,
relations
a
further.
concession from the Russians, but what does Russia get out of this deal?
Well, I would not say exactly it is a concession because Russia wants to support American and Western efforts in Afghanistan, and Russia is doing its best to support American and international forces in Afghanistan. So it's not a concession, it's exactly mutual interest. However, I would say that Russia also is expecting something from the Obama administration. Russia doesn't want to have a sort of tough trade-off, but Obama also must do something what is in favor of Russia. And I think it's very important. If you look at the comments by Obama, he says something like, let us turn the wrong page we had in our relations and let us start everything from the beginning. And that's why reset, that's why restart. While Russia wants this administration to correct mistakes of the previous administration, and Obama still hesitates to do it, and missile defense in Europe is very much about it.
Well, that's exactly the issue that I'm going to pick up on now, because that is one of the key issues between the US and Russia that remains unresolved, and one of the main obstacles to progress. The US missile defense shield in Europe, which Russia opposes. This is what President Obama had to say on one of the key points of disagreement, of tension between their two countries.
I know Russia opposes the planned configuration for missile defense in Europe, and my administration is reviewing these plans to enhance the security of America, Europe, and the world. And I've made it clear that this system is directed at preventing a potential attack from Iran. It has nothing to do with Russia. In fact, I want to work together with Russia on a missile defense architecture that makes us all safer.
So, Mr. Weitz, there has been progress on some issues, as we've been saying, but the old tensions still exist, don't they? Because the Kremlin views plans for US missile defense shield in Poland and the Czech Republic as a direct threat to its security.
Well, on paper, you basically ended up with the same agreement that you ended up with last April when President Bush and President Putin met in the Crimea. They've said the United States has not backed down from the deployments. Their offers to cooperate with Russia, President Putin several times offered to share data from Russian-controlled radars in southern Russia and Azerbaijan. The United States, under the Bush administration and apparently now under the Obama administration, has said there might be confidence-building measures such as allowing the Russians to see how the radars are being used, or mechanisms to control the number of missiles. But the Obama administration, though I think it would like to abandon the site or come up with some alternative, hasn't yet done that. And I think it's because they've been concerned that they don't want to look too weak to Russia. There's also concern at home. The administration's getting a lot of criticism for perhaps being a bit too soft on Russia.
Well, Ivan Sanfranchuk, the White House has said that the missile defense in Europe is about the threat from countries like Iran and not Russia.
There is nothing new in this statement. The Bush administration has been saying all the same. So Russia heard this very often, and there are counter arguments on the Russian side to this. The major counter argument is that the problem is not in the intentions. The problem is in the technical capability. Yes, now you are building it against Iran, and then in 5-7 years intentions change, and the technical capability, all the infrastructure is there, you update it, and then it can be used against Russia. So it's not about intentions we are arguing, it's about the technical capability, and the Obama administration should take the principal decision. They revisit mistakes of the previous administration, or they just make restart and think that the page is turned on, is
well,
turned,
Mr. Weitz, let me put that point to you.
Problems.
What are Obama's options with respect to the missile defense shield? How might he deal with this issue looking ahead? Will he hold firm to the principle of missile defense, or will he fold?
Well, just I want to make one comment about the very good comments made by my predecessor. The feeling in Washington is, yes, we need a reset, but it has to be a two-way reset. The way it's been described so far is the Obama administration needs to abandon the policies of the Bush administration and try new policies. And that may be true, but there's also some feeling that Russia needs to modify some of its own policies, say to Georgia and perhaps to missile defense. Now, the options are, there are several. One, they could just go ahead and set up the system, and there'd be something in the treaty which was in this joint statement saying that we recognize there's an interrelationship. And Medvedev has, on various points, said that this might be sufficient as long as Russians' concerns are addressed at this point. To go to much lower numbers, they probably would have to deal more directly. And there are several options. The current thinking now is perhaps you don't need to put it in Poland and the Czech Republic. You could put the radar perhaps in Turkey and put the missiles on ships in the Eastern Mediterranean or the Black Sea, but basically away from Russian forces, and that might be
missile defense
more
isn't the
acceptable. Or you
only
could have a joint
point
system.
of contention, is it? Because another point of conflict between the US and Russia is, of course, NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe, specifically in relation to Ukraine and Georgia, which saw the Russian-Georgia war in August of last year over the disputed territory of South Ossetia. Let's listen to what Obama had to say on that issue.
For any country to become a member of an organization like NATO, for example, a majority of its people must choose to. They must undertake reforms. They must be able to contribute to the alliance's mission. And let me be clear, NATO should be seeking collaboration with Russia, not confrontation.
Fred Weir, Obama there saying that NATO doesn't seek confrontation with Russia, but nevertheless the Kremlin is basically against NATO's eastward expansion. They view NATO's expansion with deep suspicions.
Yes, and nothing we've heard in the past couple of days will change anything in that particular equation. Russians have been told for the past decade or so, don't worry about NATO expansion because NATO is your friend. But they don't see it that way. They see a foreign and potentially hostile military alliance creeping up, first of all, to the former Soviet borders and now into the former Soviet Union. And this is something that's going to cause an enormous amount of trouble in the near future unless it gets sorted out one way or another. And I think this is a good example of where the Obama administration can show us how it can be not a zero-sum game, because this business of NATO expansion looks exactly to the Russians like a zero-sum game.
Ivan Sanfranchuk, if NATO expansion does continue to perhaps include countries or attempt to include countries like Georgia and Ukraine, would Russia allow that to happen?
Russia will, of course, work to prevent further expansion of NATO, in particular on Ukraine and Georgia. And let me put it in this way. Russia actually wants to make an agreement on no further expansion of NATO, in particular on Ukraine and Georgia. Washington and Brussels do not want to make such an agreement. They say that we cannot decide over the heads of the small. Every nation should decide what they want because they are sovereign, and so on and so on. And then Russia is left with no other choice but to go into internal politics of Ukraine and Georgia and try to prevent them joining NATO from inside their politics, and then tensions in Ukraine and Georgia will continue.
So are you saying that there could potentially be another conflict between Russia and Georgia if this policy of expansion continued?
No, I don't. Well, first of all, there was no Russian-Georgian war, as you said. There was an aggression of Georgia against South Ossetia, and Russia helped South Ossetia. Yeah, you can dispute it, but at least Russia did not attack Georgia. You should clearly say who started the war. And by the way, the one who started the war is still in power, and he is not under any sanctions from the international community, which is also an argument in Russia to say that there are clearly double standards on your friends are good and our friends are not necessarily.
Well, Mr. White, we've been hearing a lot about this Cold War mentality. Obama has made it clear that he wants to establish a different kind of relationship with Russia. But as he himself has pointed out, it's hard to change the habits ingrained in our governments and bureaucracies for decades, he said. Just how difficult or challenging is it going to be to overcome the attitudes and the policies of the past?
Well, it's difficult, though not impossible. We saw during the 1990s that many influential Russians renounced the communist system, which they had been brought up with for decades. Some of them openly embraced Western values, Western political, economic, and perhaps even military ideas. Now, things didn't go well in the 1990s, so that's actually reinforced this legacy. So you've got this Cold War legacy of hostility, and then you've got the 1990s where the Russians feel that they were not supported sufficiently in their reform efforts, that the United States and NATO took advantage of their weaknesses to expand and their influence in the world. So you've got really a lot of baggage that has to be overcome, but it's certainly possible, and I certainly applaud the President for addressing the upcoming generations.
Well, you make a very good point. Let me put that to Fred Weir, actually, about the domestic constraints on Russia, because there was this sense of disappointment after the Soviet bloc was dismantled in the late 1980s, early 1990s. Is it virtually impossible for President Medvedev to make unilateral concessions to the U.S.?
Well, I think so, and I think the feeling in Russia is that they made a lot. Not to rehash all this stuff about the 1990s, but the feeling is that Russia went into full strategic retreat during the 1990s, gave away the whole farm, got nothing in return. The Putin administration came in pretty much on a backlash, and the feeling that Russia wasn't going to lie down and take it anymore. And that is the dominant mood, not just in the Kremlin, but also in Russian society. So somehow, I'm not saying that compromise is impossible, but it requires a better dialogue than the one we're hearing even today has to be implemented.
So a great deal of historical baggage that perhaps casts a shadow over the current status of relations between the two countries. Ivan Sanfranchuk, what did you make of the tone of the discussions? Because President Medvedev himself noted that President Obama had listened to Russian objections on missile defense, using perhaps softer language on that issue than Russian officials have done in the past.
Well, I don't think that Russia has reasons to complain that Russia is not heard. Russia was quite attentively listened also by the Bush administration. The only problem is that this did not result in anything. So Bush was listening to Russia and doing nothing. Probably Obama is going to do the same. So Russia wants not only to be listened, but Russia wants to be taken into account. And that is the problem, whether the Obama administration will do it or not.
But Mr. Medvedev has gone a little further than that, hasn't he? Because he said himself that the talks with President Barack Obama on Monday marked a first but very important step towards revitalizing relations between the two countries.
Yes, absolutely. You are coming to a very right point, because Medvedev was saying that we have a big room for improvement in our bilateral relations. But at the same time, I would draw your attention to the words of Obama yesterday, when he said that actually he and Medvedev accomplished everything they agreed in London. I don't think that the view is the same on the Russian side. I think Russia thinks that there is still a lot to do. We can't say that everything is fine.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for joining us, Ivan Sanfranchuk in Moscow. Also in Moscow, Fred Weir, and in Washington, D.C., Richard Weiss. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We, of course, welcome your comments and suggestions. Email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.